have ever dealt with a toxic coworker and wondered why nothing seems to happen to them? This conversation is for you. One of the most common questions I hear is this: why do I have to be the one to change my behavior? Why is there no accountability for them? And that frustration is legitimate. You are doing your job, you're trying to be professional, and someone else is undermining you, exhausting you, or quietly sabotaging your work while appearing to get away with it. Over time, the damage isn't just what they do, it's what happens to you. Your confidence erodes, your nervous system stays activated, and you start second-guessing yourself, and your sense of safety at work slowly disappears. So I want to break down 3 things. Why toxic coworkers often don't face consequences, what may actually be happening behind the scenes that you're not allowed to see, and most importantly, what you can actually control in these situations. Because here's the hard truth: waiting for someone else to be held accountable puts your well-being in someone else's hands. And that's not a strategy. Let's start with something that creates a lot of confusion and a lot of anger. Most behavior that people experience as toxic at work does not meet the legal or policy threshold for intervention. There's a gap between what feels harmful and what is actionable. And in a legal sense, a hostile work environment usually has to meet very specific criteria. It must be tied to a protected class, such as race, gender, religion, age, disability, or national origin. It must be severe or pervasive, and it must interfere with your ability to do your job. And that means many common workplace behaviors live in a gray zone: undermining, exclusion, credit taking, passive aggression, micromanagement, chronic instability, quiet retaliation. These behaviors can be destructive and destabilizing without being illegal. And that doesn't make them acceptable. It doesn't mean that they aren't harmful, but it does mean that HR's formal options are often limited. What's difficult or toxic is not the same as what violates policy or law. And when someone's behavior lives in that gray zone, termination or formal discipline may not be available even when the impact is real. Understanding this gap matters, not because it excuses the behavior, but because it helps you stop waiting for a system to respond in ways that it was never designed to. Let's talk about what might be happening behind the scenes. Sometimes leadership actually is working on a problem and you're not allowed to know. Building a case for discipline or termination takes time. HR and legal teams move slowly by design because the organization has to protect itself from wrongful termination claims. That means documentation, warnings, patterns, opportunities to correct behavior, paper trails that can withstand legal scrutiny. That process can take months. And during that time, from the outside, it often looks like nothing is happening and you're not going to be updated. Investigations and disciplinary processes involving other employees are confidential. HR cannot tell you what steps are being taken, even if you are affected. So silence does not automatically mean inaction. But here's the part that people miss. Even when leadership is working on it, the process rarely protects you. You are still exposed. You are still absorbing the impact. You're still operating inside the dysfunction. And there's another important reality. HR cannot act on informal venting. So if complaints are shared quietly, emotionally, or off the record, there is no documentation and no pattern, no case. Hallway conversations do not create accountability. If someone wants the system to respond, there has to be formal reporting and written documentation. That is the only thing that creates a record the organization can use. And even then, action is not guaranteed. To understand why toxic coworkers often survive, you have to understand how dysfunction actually moves through organizations. Toxic workplaces are fundamentally about dysregulation cascading through a system. So often there is one or more dysregulated people in positions of power, and they operate from threat responses, fear of looking incompetent, fear of losing control, fear of status loss. And because they are dysregulated, they micromanage, they destabilize, they create chaos, they shift direction. They react instead of lead. And that dysregulation flows downward. The people directly beneath them become activated and they operate in survival mode. And if they can't regulate and buffer that pressure, they pass it down to the next layer. And that is why two teams under the same leader can have completely different experiences. When the layers between you and power can regulate, dysfunction is absorbed. When they can't, dysfunction accelerates downward. I have seen this clearly in my own experience in the federal government. There was a senior leader who was deeply fragile and narcissistic, and I didn't report directly to him, but there were layers between us. And those layers were constantly antagonized and destabilized by him. They couldn't regulate. They couldn't buffer. So everything came down on us. And other parts of the organization, under different chains of command, were far less affected. Not because the top leader was different, but because the buffering capacity was. And that is why toxic coworkers don't get removed easily. They aren't just individual problems. They are symptoms of a dysregulated system that keeps functioning anyway. And systems prioritize continuity over well-being. So let's talk about control. You cannot control whether someone gets fired. You cannot control how fast HR moves. You cannot control whether leadership is dysregulated. You cannot control the cascade. But you can control how much of that dysfunction you absorb. Regulation is not about tolerating bad behavior. It's about staying clear-headed enough to protect yourself. You can learn to recognize when someone is operating from threat instead of competence. You can stop personalizing behavior that isn't about you. You can choose how you communicate and document. You can decide when to engage and when not to. You can set strategic boundaries instead of emotional ones. And you can decide whether this environment is tolerable or whether it's time to plan an exit without panic or self-blame. You can also invest in your own regulation and resilience, not to survive forever, but to maintain agency. Therapy, regulation practices, supportive relationships outside the system, skills that increase your mobility and options. None of this is fair. You should not have to work this hard to function at work. But fairness isn't the point. Agency is. So when you ask, why do I have to be the one to change? The answer is this: because waiting for accountability that may never come leaves you exposed. You deserve better than that. You may not be able to control whether they face consequences, but you can control whether their dysfunction takes your well-being with it. That is the difference between staying stuck and staying clear.